can just like get right into the fun part with, Stalin! Okay, so this is the most important dude to be alive in the last 500 years, not because of what he did or who he was, but because of who he scared. Us. We were so petrified at the idea that we were going to face down his armies on the plains of Europe that we knew we needed allies. Millions of people, not to stand with us, but to stand in front of us, to soak up ammo. And since the Europeans had just been through the worst war in human history, the price for that was high. So we sent our Navy out to patrol the global ocean so that anyone could go anywhere without a military escort and access any commodity in any market if in exchange you would sign up for the Cold War. And it worked. And then we won, and the wall came down. And in a series of ever more narcissistic political contests, we went with the economic populist every time, except in this last election when there wasn't a non-economic populist in the race. Now, there's a lot to unpack there. We can go in any direction with it. But the most important impact for today's system isn't so much what's going on in American politics, but what's going on with the demographic picture, because we live differently now. In the pre-Stalin world, the world was agricultural, and it had a demographic mostly like this. You got children at the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top, men on one side, women the other. Mortality builds a pyramid. And in this, you have a very specific economic model. When you have a lot of people in the bottom half of the pyramid, it's people who are raising their kids and building houses. And that generates a lot of activity, but these people are not very skilled. So worker productivity is low, inflation is high, consumption is high. But most of the capital that drives a modern system is from a group up here in their 50s and early 60s who are preparing for retirement because their kids have gone home, so they're saving. Well, that's not a very big group. So you don't have a lot of capital. The government can't levy a lot of taxes because there aren't a lot of wealthy people to tax. So services are low, infrastructure is poor, value added is low, but you do get a lot of growth and inflation from that. Stalin changed this because our reaction to Stalin created the global system, created globalization, created interconnected supply chains and global energy and global manufacturing, and that meant all the people who were down here who were low value added suddenly had options. When you live on a farm, kids are free labor. You have as many of them as you can put up with, plus one. That's how you find out it's too many. But if there are manufacturing jobs available, those are all in town. And when you move from a farm to a condo, kids are no longer free labor and you have fewer of them. You fast forward that 75 years, and here's where the Koreans are now. Radically different economic system. You no longer have all the consumption from down below. You have a lot of those capital-rich, highly skilled people up above, though. So the tax base is huge. The investment base is huge. Capital costs plummet. It's easy to get a loan. Different system. And the whole world has gone down this path. Different speeds, different starting points. We're all on the same road. And this decade, the Koreans lead us into whatever's next. Because within 10 years, that bulge at the top moves into mass retirement. And the Koreans will have to figure out an economic model that is not based on consumption or production or investment. What will that look like? I have no idea. This has never happened before in human history. But we're about to find out together. All right. The United States is a little bit different on the demographic profile for two reasons. Number one, for us, globalization was a bribe. We did not invest our economy in it like everyone else did. Then we would have just been another empire, no one would have joined. So we industrialized more slowly. Second, there's a lot of elbow room in the United States. So we didn't go from farm to city. We went from farm to small town to suburb to city. And those two extra steps really slowed down the drop in our birth rate. And so we now have the highest birth rate, the healthiest demography in the rich world. Europe, we need to start thinking about a post-Europe world because we're going to reach that real soon. They're dying out. The majority of the ethnicities in Europe will not exist in a nation-state form within 30 years. That's something we've never had to wrestle with before. Brazil, you'll notice, This decline here is faster than ours. We are aging less quickly than Brazil, than India, than Indonesia, than Mexico. You fast forward to the year 2050, our average age will be younger than all of them. We're the only advanced country aside from New Zealand who can lay claim to that. And then here's China. This is already one of the 5 fastest aging workforces in human history, and this data is wrong. This is from last June. In July, they updated it. Check out the bottom. The Chinese are now reporting in official statistics that their birth rate has dropped more than since 2017 than what happened to the Jews of Europe during the Holocaust. And this is wrong. The Shanghai Academy of Sciences says that this overcounts the Chinese population by over 100 million, suggesting that these yellow bars don't even exist. And independent demographers in China, the majority of which are now under house arrest, say that this is still wrong. They're saying that the overcount is closer to 250 million. But let's just work with this. We don't have an economic model as a species that functions with what this is going to look like in just 10 years. That's at most how much time the People's Republic of China has left as an industrialized, unified nation state. There's plenty of reasons to think they won't last that long. We'll come back to that. Okay, here's us. I have been waiting my entire adult life to say this. The boomers are almost gone. As of the 4th quarter of calendar year 2022, the majority of the boomers in the United States had already retired. Now, that takes us a couple of places. First of all, when you move into retirement, you liquidate your portfolio and go into more conservative investments. The velocity of money slows. Well, half of that has already happened. $76 trillion in boomer assets have already been liquidated. The capital cost increase we've seen in the last 4 years, roughly a tripling in costs. It's not the Fed, it's not Biden, it's not Trump, it's the boomers rolling one final grenade into the room on their way out. And they're not all retired yet. That will happen over the next several years. So you should expect capital costs to continue to go up at more or less the same pace we've seen these last 4 years for at least another 4. It's not a business cycle thing. It's demographic, supply and demand. Second, boomers were the largest workforce we've ever had. Half of them have already retired. Big part of the inflation story now, and especially into the future, is trying to replace that. And the generation that's coming in from below, the Zoomers, is the smallest generation we've ever had. This calendar year, the difference between the exiting boomers and the entering Zoomers is a shortage, just this year, of almost 700,000 workers. That number will increase every year for the next 11 before peaking at just over 1 million, just shy of 1.1 million. How do we know? They're all here already. We know exactly what the inflow is into the workforce for the next 20 years. They're already born. But there is hope, and it lies with the millennials. The oldest millennials today are 45, which means in 10 years, they'll be turning 55 and they'll be entering that very capital-rich part of their lifespan. So all we have to do to get back to a capital structure that looks a little bit better is wait. Same for labor. It's not the millennials themselves, they're already in the labor force. But a large generation generates a large generation. So the boomers generated the millennials will generate Generation Alpha. So all we have to do to wait for the labor situation to get back to something that's more comfortable is wait for Generation Alpha to grow up and get trained in the workforce. Hire or borrow, hire or borrow, hire or borrow. You're gonna remember nothing else, remember those 2 words. All we have to do for the capital situation to start to fix itself is wait 10 years, 12 years. And all we have to do to wait for the labor situation to fix itself is to wait 20 years, 22 years. That's it. We're good. Just gotta wait. So hire and borrow now, because these are the cheapest labor costs and the cheapest capital costs we will see for 1 to 2 decades. It's not the Fed. It's not Trump. It's not Biden. It's the boomers. One last time. Okay. This is Israel, including the Palestinian territories. The blue on the outside, that's the Palestinians. The light blue in the middle, that's the Jews. What I want you to pay attention to is the yellow. These are the Jews who don't work, don't pay taxes, and don't serve in the military, the ultra-Orthodox. The Israelis are already, the Israelis who work and serve are already a minority in the geographic space that is Israel and the occupied territories, already. But the ever-widening group here means that the amount of resources the Israelis have to carry out whatever it is they think they need to do is going to be steadily shrinking as they basically get a welfare class that is on the verge of becoming a plurality in their system over the next 20 years. That's a different sort of political system that we have never had before. And if you think Israeli policy has this combination of reticence and desperation right now, just wait until the stack of resources that they have to work with slims down. We should expect things in the Palestinian territories to get significantly worse over the next 20 years. What we're seeing in Gaza right now, this is the opening act. Speaking of Gaza, okay, I have lived in Texas, big state, very proud of the shape of their state. I am from Iowa, that's the 25th largest state. I now live in Colorado, which ranks in the 33. Alabama is not a huge state, but I think we all agree that we make fun of states that are smaller than ours, right? I mean, like Connecticut, is that even a place? Here's the smallest of the small, this is Rhode Island. This is not to scale. Now it's to scale. This is gonna sound awful. This is gonna sound heartless. Gaza doesn't matter to anyone. Doesn't absorb anything except for aid, doesn't transit anything at all, doesn't produce anything. No one cares about Gaza unless they choose to care about Gaza. It's not economic, it's not strategic for anyone. Now, you go back to October of last year, and the Israelis found some very compelling reasons to care about Gaza. But anyone else who is swimming in this pond and playing in this discussion pool, they're doing it because they want to. Now, the country to this point that has chosen to make a point out of Gaza the most is Iran, because they saw the Israelis as distracted and they thought they could have a little bit of fun, and so they started poking. And about a month ago, 6 weeks ago now, the Israelis had had enough. They're a little sensitive right now. And they dropped a bomb on a consulate, on diplomatic territory in Damascus, and killed the entire leadership of the Iranian IRGC in the region. People that they had spent 30 years training, gone in a flash. And the Iranians like, oh, we didn't realize that this was as serious as you thought it was. Sorry, bro, we're gonna back off, but we have to save some face. So we're gonna take these like 380 munitions, missiles and everything, and we're gonna throw them at you. But we don't want you to misunderstand what we're doing here. This is face saving, nothing else. So we're gonna tell you what the equipment is. We're gonna tell the specs. We're gonna tell you where they're gonna be launched from. We're gonna tell you what the flight paths are. We're gonna tell you the time we're gonna launch them and the time we expect them to strike. So you can like work with people and like shoot them all down, right? And so that's what they did. And then they're like, are we okay, bro? Because all of them were shot down, no one was hurt. There's one pothole and one runway. That was the damage in Israel. And Israel's response is, we are not your bro. They launched one attack with about a dozen munitions. They blew up the most sophisticated anti-aircraft system that the Iranians had that just happened to be parked immediately adjacent to the Iranians' primary nuclear research facility. The subtext was pretty clear. We did this by ourselves. We did this without crossing into your airspace, and we could have done so much more, bro. And they agreed that now is not the time to have a fight. And at the moment, with the notable exception of Gaza, no one in the Middle East wants a fight in the Middle East. In fact, the only country in the world that wants a fight in the Middle East is Russia. This is as good as the Middle East gets. Savor it. All right, let's talk China. These are some monthly labor costs for a number of countries in Southeast Asia that I think will do very well in a deglobalizing world. Here are our Mexican partners right in the middle, very competitive, and here are the Chinese. The only reason we still envision China as an industrial superpower is because of the sunk cost of the industrial plant. They're no longer the low-cost producer for anything, even with their subsidies. Now, the sunk cost of that plant is over 35 trillion US. That is not a rounding error. You do not move away from that overnight. But I have not had a conversation with a manufacturer who has relocated supply chains from China to anywhere else in the world, who hasn't simply discovered a shorter supply chain system with less political interference, less corruption, cheaper energy costs, but just cheaper in general. It's a win-win. The question is pace, because you don't just move $35 trillion of commitment overnight. How fast can we move? Depends upon who you are. In textiles, we're almost done. In automotive, we'll probably be done within 2 years. Semiconductors will take longer. We have to pick our battles. Okay, let's talk capital. This is the private credit curve for the United States. It's all private credit from all sources to all sources. Everything is in here, whether you're going to charge a stick of gum or build an industrial park. The only thing not included is the overnight window for the interbanking system. Everything else is in here. Now, from 2000 at the start of the chart to 2007 in the middle, 7.5 years, we roughly doubled total private credit. That was a bubble. That was too much. That was too fast. As a result, we had the subprime correction, which knocked 5% off of headline GDP. Most of us remember that, right? Remember how much fun that was? Doubling, 5% correction. Same data, different scale. Again, doubling, 5% correction. Here's Canada. Do we have any Canadians here today? You guys should be in charge of the border. Okay, I would argue that from 2000 to 2007, Canada had the healthiest banking sector on the planet. They didn't even have something called subprime up there. They certainly didn't have asset-backed securities. And so when the crisis hit, they were fine. But they had a eminently Canadian response. They're like, Americans just had the greatest recession ever. We can totally have a greater recession. And they started force-feeding into their system everything that we were in the process of ripping out by the roots. They built a subprime model. They started doing ABS. And it got really scary over the next few years. But by 2013, 2014, they're like, maybe we don't want to win this one. And they dialed it back. They're not out of the woods. But I feel the best about Canadian finance than I have at any time in the last 10 years. And these days, I take my good news where I can. Germany. Should you want to buy a house in Germany, you don't get your 20% together and go to the bank to finance the other 80 with a mortgage. No. You go to the bank, you declare your intentions, and they're like, that's great. Today, write us a check for what you anticipate your monthly payment being. And then come back next month and do it again. And again. And again, and again, and again, and again, and again. Do it 60 times. And after 5 years of you paying a mortgage without having a house, you can then apply for the loan. There are a number of problems in the German system. I would argue that several of them are system killing. Credit overextension, however, does not make the list. That's really more of a Greece problem. 7-fold increase of credit in 7 years, we know how that went. They had a depression that hit twice as hard as the Great Depression, and they still haven't crawled out of it. Australia, I love the Australians. They're like us, but like with more character. Okay, Australia and America have very, very similar approaches to governance. We're very physically large countries with relatively light populations and large sections. And so there's an understanding almost innately that most of the decisions that govern your life should be made relatively close to where you live. So we have strong local and state governments that are balanced by a federal government with limited prerogatives. But we're not dogmatic about it. We realize there's certain things that have to be made at the center. So national defense, for example, financial regulation, for example. So we keep that concentrated so if there is a crisis, singular action can be taken quickly to mitigate the effects. So example, if you go back to the subprime crisis here, at the height of it, Sheila Bair of the FDIC and Paulson at Treasury and Bernanke at the Fed basically got together after a really hard day to throw back some drinks at a bar. They crowded around a two-top and in less than an hour sketched out the rough mechanics of what would soon be unveiled to the world as TARP, the restitution program that put a floor to the crisis, committed the government to the recovery, and set the stage for ultimately healing the system. The Australians did something very similar, but there was one big difference between the two. In the American system, we were really worried about conflicts of interest. We were worried about bad actors. So if you had done something stupid as a lender or as a lendee, you were on the hook for some of the loss in order to qualify for the funds. Australia had the same system as us without that hook. They just guaranteed all mortgages. Furthermore, to make sure that the sector could continue to grow, they said that if you could prove that you could pay your mortgage payment with a 100% government guarantee, you automatically qualified for a second mortgage, and a third, and a fourth. The Aussies have yet to begin their subprime adjustment 15 years later. And when they do, oh my God, you do not want to own property down under. India, almost an identical program to what the Australians did with one little difference. To qualify for the funds, you had to be a personal friend of the Prime Minister. And here are the Chinese. As my Aunt Mary is somewhat infamous in my family for saying, are you kidding me? This is what we've been intimidated by? On a good day, the Chinese economy is less well managed than Enron on a bad day. And it's every economic subsector. I mean, I'm sure, this is how you get $35 trillion of sunk cost into the investment system, of course. But have you heard what's going on in their housing sector? The ghost cities? Shanghai Academy of Sciences, the wise men again. They estimate that if all of the condos that have never been lived in China were opened up to the public and people could move in, that they could house an additional 1.5 to 3 billion people. That is more spare housing in China that exists in the rest of the world combined times 5. They're probably worth 10 cents on the dollar. And that's where the majority of private savings is. That's not even the sector that's most affected by this. That would be agriculture. So when this goes, and we know how this story ends, we know how it always ends. You don't really simply destroy every manufacturing system in the country. You don't simply destroy all private savings in the housing market. You also have famine. 10 years is what demographics tells us they have left. If nothing else goes wrong, plenty of other things are going wrong. Now, you would think that this is the sort of scenario where an authoritarian government who didn't have to answer to elections or special interests, that was rooted throughout the population, could really take a good hard look at things, keep their eye on the horizon, come up with a plan to, if not solve this, at least deflect it. Yeah, that's not the government that China has. China has a cult of personality. And Chairman Xi has exiled, intimidated, silenced, imprisoned, or just flat out killed everyone in the system at this point who is capable of conscious thought. He spent 13 years doing it, and there's really not a lot left. The bureaucracy has taken their cues from him. They don't want anything to happen that might challenge the narrative as espoused by Xi at any given point. And so they've just basically stopped collecting data on things they think that might be problematic. Not collecting it and then smothering it, just not collecting it. So you remember when they opened after COVID, they just stopped collecting death data from all sources. So we don't know how many people have died in China in the last year and a half. No idea. You remember the little spat they had about youth unemployment? They stopped collecting it because that number hit 25%, highest in the world. Like, oh, that's embarrassing. They've since started issuing the data again, but they're not including anyone who's looking for a job. Bond market. There is now no longer data collected on what is on offer, who's buying or who's selling. How do you have a bond market like that? Well, you can't, and that forces everything into the credit system at the bank level with the government controls. Ones I worry about a little bit more, biographies of local politicians, college dissertations, and patents. Because these are people who, if they can be discovered, can get their fingers into the system and start to climb the societal ladder. But that might challenge Xi, so they don't collect any of it anymore. But I think the best example I can give you of how this is all going to hell is that stupid balloon. Now, when that thing floated in from China, floated in from Canada, and thanks for that, by the way, Canadians, I had the same response as Joe Biden. Clearly, this is a spy platform. It's 350 feet across. It's dangling something the size of an Embraer jet. Here in Birmingham, you know Embraer jets, right? You know, one seat on one side, two on the other. They're cramped, they're tiny, unless they're hanging from a balloon, in which case they have a little heft. Clearly, it's a spy platform. Shoot it down. Let's see what we've got. Joe Biden gave that order. Now, the United States government has many failings, but vertical information transfer among the national security apparatus isn't on the list. And so in the bowels of the Pentagon, the bottom sublevel, past the physical plant at the end of the hall, is that guy that nobody wants to have a conversation with. He is a balloon expert. I love balloons. And his report made it up to the top. And so the CIA director and the defense secretary had to sit down with the president and say, Mr. President, please don't shoot this balloon down. Mr. President, we know exactly where it's going to go. It's going to float over our missile silos in Montana. But Mr. President, unless we have grossly misunderstood your priorities in the last cabinet meeting, it doesn't sound like you're planning on nuking anyone this week. Which means, Mr. President, when that balloon floats over, the hatches will be closed. Because, Mr. President, they're always closed. You only open them when you're serious about things. They will get photographs of closed hatches from 7 miles away. Mr. President, this is not a national security threat. Mr. President, what it is an opportunity. Because if you let us do our jobs, we will put a spy plane over this thing and a spy helicopter under this thing. We will redirect every whisper sensor we can, and we will track this for the next 9 days. We will get copies of all of their cryptography. We will see how they're sending data through the civilian network, how they're sending taskings from the satellite system. And Mr. President, the NSA, who is not invited to this meeting because we hate them, they will do their jobs. And they will be able to tell you at the end of 9 days, not what city or block or building or floor or office, but what terminal is controlling this thing in Beijing. And they will hack the tar out of that terminal because that's what they do. And they will tag everyone who comes into contact with it. And we together will rip apart their intelligence system from the inside out. Mr. President, this is the intel breakthrough of the decade, and they just handed it to us. And so Joe Biden, with the mental fortitude that we've all become familiar with, says something along the lines of, yeah, do that. So we did. We now know from the after action that Xi was unaware of the existence of the balloon until after it had been shot down. It was just some in their intelligence bureau thought, this is what wolf warrior diplomacy means. It's the dumbest thing I have seen any country do this century. And if you think back to 2000, we've not had a shortage of dumb. This is happening at every level of government in every economic sector across the entire system. Demographics tells us 10 years. They are perfectly capable of driving their system into the ground on an accelerated time frame, and they are putting their back into it. There are many things about China I worry about. Their strength is not on that list. This is. Whether China's fall is good, bad, or indifferent to you depends upon who you are and what you care about. We're all going to feel this, though. This is an inflation graphic put together by the American Enterprise Institute. It's one of my favorite graphics out there. The double yellow bar is where total inflation since 2000 is in the United States, roughly a 75% price increase. Everything above that line, the reds, that's something that in real inflation index terms has gotten more expensive. Everything below in blue has gotten cheaper. I'm oversimplifying here a little bit, but everything in blue is something you plug into a wall and it beeps and it whirs. It's a manufactured good, and because of having 1 billion industrial workers and bottomless subsidies, that's where China excels. Everything above that line requires skills and souls and fingers and eyes. People, skill-based things. That's what we're good at. If all we do is pick up the industrial plant from China and redistribute it other places, it's not going to work nearly as well at that price because the subsidization is not there, the overpopulation of the worker force is not there. So we should start to expect a significantly higher cost of living for anything that involves a manufactured product. That is baked in. Now, how much that increases is going to vary product by product, country by country. But that is something that just has to happen. All right, let's talk about some of those products. If you're at the bottom of this, your supply chain is so simple, you can write it down on the back of a cocktail napkin after throwing back a couple of bourbons. If you're at the top, you don't know who your 4th tier suppliers are, much less your 14th. If you're at the left, you are locked within the Chinese system on the mainland. If you're on the right, you're already under the NATO umbrella. Everyone got that? Let's get our groundings. I'm going to pull a few out of these that are particularly sexy. If you want to worry about something, these are the things to worry about. Chemicals are the raw materials that allow everything else to work. Electrical steel, if we're going to double the size of the industrial plant, that's a lot of electricity. We need to increase the grid by half. Materials processing, technically simple, but China, because of subsidies, has basically cornered the market for 50 to 70% of the product based on what you're looking at. And then machinery is the stuff that builds other stuff. These are the 4 things that if we don't get right, we can't attempt to do anything else. So the good news, courtesy of the shale revolution, we've already done this. Shale revolution has kicked out so much spare natural gas as waste products that our chemical sector has expanded to absorb it all. And the United States is now the lowest cost, highest quality, highest volume producer of every single intermediate chemical product. And we're now starting to turn that into end manufacturing. Done. Materials processing, barely started that. On the upside, most of the technologies involved are 100 years old, and all you need is energy and a site. This is going to be really heavy in the Gulf Coast, I would anticipate. It's cheap, it's fast, but that's not the same as saying that it's free and instant. We're going to need a couple of years to spin all that up. Electrical steel is a bigger problem. You usually only forge a lot of that stuff at the time that you're electrifying for the first time. For us, that was the 50s and the 60s. And since then, the amount of electrical steel that we make has just steadily dropped. If we're going to increase the grid by half in the next decade, we need about 30 times as much electrical steel as we have now. Now, like materials processing, it's not expensive, it doesn't take a lot of time, but we need to get to it. And that assumes no green transition. The green transition would expand our need for electricity by another 50%. We try to do both of those at the same time, that'll be stressful. And then machinery. The world's top source of high quality machinery is Germany, and Germany's demographics tells that they're also in their last decade. The world's top supplier of low quality machinery is China. Luckily, the world's 2nd largest supplier of both is Houston. Anyone from Houston here? Good, they're making machinery. Growth sector. You break down globalization, everyone has to figure out how to make it work more or less on their own. Or maybe you do keep an alliance together, like maybe NATO. When all of a sudden, all the Europeans who've been thinking that history was over, all of a sudden realize that all of their weapons date back to the 80s. All of that is going to Ukraine, which means they now need to rearm with more modern stuff. It's difficult to find a growth sector for the next 3 years that's going to be better than that one. Okay, semiconductors. Oversimplification here, it's a messy sector, but you can kind of break it into 3 general categories. You got your low-end semis, 90 nanometers and bigger, that are nearly analog, only do 2 or 3 things. This is the Internet of Things. You've got your mid-grade, 90 to 10 nanometers. This is most of what we use every day. Automotive, aerospace, power management, any phone that's not the iPhone. 10 nanometer and better, the iPhone. Satellite communications, electric vehicles, artificial intelligence, the low end. 10% Japan, 10% the United States, 80% China. How many of you have a singing margarita machine? How many of you want a singing margarita machine? Get that sort of stuff now. Now, I would argue that the Internet of Things has not proven to be nearly as sexy as we all thought it was going to be a few years ago. I would say that we can do without this stuff. And if we decide a few years down the line that we really do want that, the technology is 25 years old. It's not hard. We can expand it if we want to, but we don't really need it. The stuff at the high end, the technologies of the future, 95% of those chips come from one town in Taiwan. Oh, it's so much worse than it sounds, because the Taiwanese may be the operators of the fabrication facilities, but the constellation of companies that allow those facilities to be built and operated, that's 9,000 firms, half of which only produce one product for one end user, and they have no competition anywhere in the world. You peel out a couple of them, the whole system stops. I'm most concerned personally about Germany because that's where the lenses for the lithography comes from. We're going to have to rebuild that entire ecosystem. That's going to take 10 to 15 years. AI, I'm actually kind of proud of us as a society for having the conversations that we're having about this new technology and the impact it'll have on the workforce and on culture and equality and everything else. It's so rare that Americans think forward when it comes to technology. We usually just wait for it to overcome us and then kind of freak out a little bit. But I think we have an extra decade or 2 to work out the kinks because we're not going to be able to make enough of the chips. Stuff in the middle, 10 to 90. That comes from 15 different countries, Israel to Ireland to Korea. The supply chain system, the ecosystem that makes it possible is robust. It's redundant. There's a lot of competition. You could peel entire continents out of that supply chain system and the rest of it will still be able to function. So the chips that we need for everyday operations that we're dependent upon, that all looks good. The chips of the future are going to take a breather. The chips of the past are going to take a breather. I'm okay with this, but it does mean there's a lot of economic opportunity to fill in the gaps. Okay, you guys ready for politics? Let's piss off everyone. Okay, let me show my colors first. I'm an independent. I have been an independent my entire political life, and I am a real independent. So 25 to 30% of the population on each side are always vote Republican or always vote Democrat. Then there's another 15 to 20% on the shoulders that say they're independent, but 90 to 95% of the time they vote single ticket. There's only 10% in the middle of people like me who actually vote swap and actually go down and vote for different people, different times, and different parties. So 10%. Historically speaking, the United States has what's called a first past the post single member district system, which is a sexy political science way of saying that you vote for one person who wants to represent a specific group of people. And in that sort of system, the winner has to get one more vote than whoever comes in second. And that encourages big tent parties because you're chasing the marginal votes to get that one extra so you can win. If you have 12 parties, doesn't work because someone will form a coalition of say 3 or 4 of them It can just outvote everybody. Okay? So two big parties. That's how it always works. It's constitutional. You get a third party, it can only come in for a brief period of time. The system that we are leaving, emphasis on the word leaving, looks like this. Democrats on the left, Republicans on the right, swing voters in the middle. And if you remember back to the race between Trump and Hillary Clinton, it didn't break that way. This is how it ultimately turned out. Now, this is normal. The weakness of a big tent system is it's not very adaptable to long-term change. So you change the technology suite, you change economic patterns, you change demographics or geopolitics, and the political system has to move around to reflect that. And the factions jump ship, switch sides, independents form new coalitions. Lots of things can go down. This is the sixth time the United States has been through one of these transition periods. And it started about 8 years ago. Now, that means we have to look at this a little bit different. If you're at the bottom, you want the government to play a role in regulating social norms. If you're at the top, you want the government out of your personal life. If you're on the right, you want the government out of your wallet. And if you're on the left, you think the government should have a hand in everyone's wallets in order to get the resources to make society into a new form. And you can combine these. So for example, if you're a social liberal and an economic conservative, the top right, you really deeply, personally appreciate all the hard work that all the bureaucrats in Washington have done, and you want to get them all together so you can throw a party and serve arsenic cake. Okay? Here are all those factions again on the matrix. Red for Republicans, blue for Democrats, green for swing. The single biggest impact that Donald Trump has had on our political structures is he elevated a specific faction that had been on the out. The populists on the right had not really voted in elections for 6 cycles. Trump brought them in from the cold. They got a taste of power. They're now the most consolidated and the most numerous of all of our political factions, and they are not going away. But in bonding with this group, he deliberately picked fights with the folks that had been the adults in the room in the Republican Party. He purged them from his administration. He ran against their champions for Congress. And as of January, has fully removed them from all of the Republican Party apparatus at the national level. They are no longer Republicans. They're swing voters, like me. If you're in that group, come on in, the water's awful. But in doing that, he did reach out to some groups that were closer to his social conservative core, and we had more people who switched sides. That's today's Republican coalition under Trump. It's loyal, it's dense, and it's not enough to win a national election. The reason that the Republicans have done well these last 70 years is very simple. They don't have more voters than the Democrats, and now they have less. But they're cohesive, and they always show up because their factions don't fight. The abortion folks don't care about military policy. The military voters don't care about fiscal policy. Everyone has an issue they care about. They all show up. It's a solid block. That is not true anymore. So what Trump has done is he's introduced Democratic Party-style instability into the minority coalition. And so if he's going to win, he has to be able to reach out to other factions, and that is not something he's good at. So just on that, we're already looking at a catastrophic loss for the Republican Party. That's one. Number two, the unions have never not been part of a coalition, but now they're swing voters. We're at the beginning of the golden age of union membership in the country because we have a massive and increasing labor shortage, and we need to double the size of the industrial plant. How many of those jobs do you think are going to be blue collar? All of them? This has never happened before either. Business community, not part of a coalition. This is not sustainable, but we're in a transition period. And where these two groups ultimately end up is going to matter a great deal. I have no idea where they're going to end up. There's some examples in Europe of these guys being on the same side. That would be a powerful block. We're not there yet. I'm not saying we're going to get there. I'm saying that this is all in motion. Now, if you look at Team Biden or Team Trump, you're like, what the hell are they thinking on economic policy? This is why. Economic policy for the last 200 years in this country has been made by these two groups arguing, overpowering one another, compromising. These are the people who can do math, and they're not in the room on either side. So you either have policy coming out of MAGA, who wants to punish the business community, or out of the Greens, who think the business community is part of the problem. That's why it doesn't make sense, and that's why it won't make sense until one or the other or both finally rejoin the system. That's two. Third, me. Fewer Republicans than Democrats, remember? The Republicans have never won a national election unless they can carry the independents by a factor of 2 to 1. It's just math. This, using the most recent trustworthy polling data, if you were to have a drop-dead vote when this data came out, the red states would go red because they have enough Republicans to win without the independents. The blue states would go Democrat because they have enough votes to win without the independents. And the purples are the ones in the wind. In this steady state relationship, and I realize nothing is ever equal in politics, the Democrats have to screw up or the Republicans have to reach out. The base situation for the Electoral College favors the Democrats just because of positioning. People seem to have forgotten what happened in the last midterms. With one exception, every single candidate that Donald Trump put his finger on lost the independent vote 4 to 1. Why? Because Donald Trump told political independents that their vote doesn't matter. He told them that the only thing that matters is the primary system where he dominates. And their response was, hold my beer. For only the third time in the history of the Republic, the ruling party gained seats in the House. And the other two examples happened during Reconstruction, which I can all think we agree was a special time. That's the second reason that Donald Trump has no chance in the general election. The third is Robert Kennedy. Donald Trump thought he had cornered the crazy vote. And now it's split. Trump is going to lead what's left of the Republican Party to the second or third worst electoral defeat in American history. And this will be the last election that the Republican Party contests. Now, before you go for the pitchforks or throw me out of the building, this isn't the end of the conservative movement. This is just the end of the current Republican Party. We have been through this now 6 times. We will get through this transition. The question is what forms up on the other side. Oh, sorry, let's skip that. These two people are already working on that. When I spoke to Speaker Ryan last October, he said that now is the beginning of the fight for the soul of the conservative movement, not the Republican Party. That fight's lost. Conservative movement. And within the next 2 months, Mike Pence dropped out of the race and started a think tank to start imagining what that might look like. And when Trump defeated Haley for the presidential nomination, she joined a think tank to do the same thing. I'm not saying that a stuffy Midwesterner or a part-time Southerner are the solution to this. I'm just saying that we're already 1 foot into figuring out what is next. Whether it will be better or worse depends upon who joins what faction and how the various political factions in this country consolidate around a new sense of ideals. And for those of you who think that I'm a bleeding heart Democrat, the Democrats are like only 4 years behind the Republicans on the disintegration. And as we have seen from our previous 5 rearrangements, whichever party figures their internal doubt first tends to rule without opposition for a quarter century. I would argue that while the Republicans are clearly going to lose the presidency and the House this round, and because of Trump's convictions, maybe even the Senate, they actually have a reasonable chance of emerging in the 7th party structure in a superior position because they started earlier. Oh, one caveat, Biden has to not die. Non-zero chance. Okay, let's talk about some much more important things than American politics. These are money supplies. Most important two on here are the yellow, that's China, and the blue, that's the United States. What we got right here, this is QE 1, 2, and 3. Check out how it's fallen back. For those of us who have had economic training, something we all agree on is if you print currency like mad, if you monetize the debt, you get inflation. Do you? Look at China. Their money supply is twice that of ours. They're exporting deflation, not inflation. The reason is that the rules are changing. These are the 3 biggest economies in the world outside the United States. They are all in terminal demographic decline. What is monetary policy except a series of tools that you use to regulate demand? And if 3 of the 4 biggest economies in the world are looking at ever smaller levels of demand moving forward, then the rules, the laws, the guidelines that we have developed over this last 500 years of economic history don't apply anymore. We are going to have to make up an entirely new economic theory for a world in demographic decline. We are only starting that now. Some people say modern monetary theory is the way of the future. Some people say it's suicidal. I say, let's let someone give it a go. Do I think it's going to work? God, no. But we'll learn something. And I would rather learn something in a time of relative abundance and peace than have someone like the Germans or the Japanese make something up on the fly when they're desperate, because they've done that before and we know how that goes. Now, here in the United States, here in North America, the Canadians have found a patch to their demographic problems. We're still doing pretty well. The Mexicans even a little bit better than us. We have time. At our current pace of aging in North America, we won't face a German or a Japanese or a Korean or a Chinese style crisis until 2070. We can watch everyone else wrestle with this over the next half century, and hopefully we will learn something, even if it's all it is learning what not to do. We've got time. But we have never had the emergence and adoption of a new economic theory as a species historically without a major war, because that breaks things. All right, this is not the federal deficit. This is the net increase in government spending year on year. So if you had a $4 trillion deficit last year and a $5 trillion deficit this year, it'll come in at $1 trillion on this. So these increases, wow, unprecedented in modern history, even in wartime. This is the private credit curve showing annual increases. So I showed you the smooth one that had the total. These are the annual increases year on year. Now, you would expect, and it's reflected in the data, that in times of economic stress, the government sits in the driver's seat, pumps money into the system to encourage a recovery, while private credit takes a backseat as the system has a recession and recovers. That's what happened in the dot-com bust, in the subprime bust, and in COVID. This is normal. I mean, maybe I would rather have the orange line be lower, but this is normal. It's still reflecting the patterns we're supposed to have. This is what worries me. For the first time in American history, the paths crossed without an economic crisis, and new government spending exceeded total new private credit. Historically speaking, that has only ever happened, ever, in 5 economies. Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe in the 2000s, Venezuela in the 2010s, Argentina like 9 times, and Greece just before the subprime, or their bust. That's it. I worry about this. Now, it's only one data point. I don't want to make this bigger than it is. It might be fixed this year. But government spending has now emerged today in a time of economic wealth as the single most important determining factor in economic strategy here in the United States. That is not how it's supposed to work. And if you think forward over the next 25 years as we digest the retiring boomers, we're going to be looking at a net increase in government spending about 2% a year just to fund their pensions and healthcare, which means that that orange line is going to rise. And it's not clear that the blue line can keep up. So if you want to worry about something from a macroeconomic point of view, it's not the deficit per se, it's the imbalance. Now, hopefully we will find out in 6 months that this is just a one-off and it's no big deal. But with Biden and Trump both saying they plan to not only not slash any entitlement programs, and both plan to expand government spending, and both plan to cut taxes, I have my doubts. Okay, let's talk Ukraine. This is what's called a FAB 1500. 1500 is for its weight in kilograms, so it weighs roughly 1.5 tons. Of that 1500, about 2/3 of it is explosive power. The Soviets excelled at big bombs like these. Whenever the United States goes to war, it's on a different continent, typically in a different hemisphere. And so we have to travel a long distance, which means that our weapon systems can't be based on weight and bulk. They have to be based on range and, above all else, precision. So we have small bombs, typically less than 500 pounds, that we deliver at range to hit within a few feet of what we're aiming at. You remember the JDAMs from Desert Storm? Some of these younger people are like, Desert what? Designed to hit within roughly 10 meters of their target. We have now gotten that down to less than 10 feet of their target. Range, precision. Not this. This has a blast radius of 1/3 of a kilometer. So the Russians don't fight on a different hemisphere. They fight along their border. And so they can have shorter supply lines with bigger bombs, and they just throw huge amounts of ordnances at their target. And if they miss, that's fine. It's got a big blast radius, and they have 4 more lined up. They have not been using these in Ukraine because they're not accurate until recently. The Battle of Avdiivka, which was a couple months ago, they used 300 of these in less than 36 hours, just completely obliterated the defenders' positions. Why the change in strategy? Well, they started putting something called a flight kit on it. That's basically what we do with JDAMs. And that allowed this thing to hit not with an accuracy of 1/4 of a mile, but within about 50 meters. From our point of view, that's laughable accuracy. But if you've got a blast radius of 1/3 of a mile, it's enough. And in the last 6 weeks, they've started dropping these in civilian areas, specifically going after power infrastructure. They're no longer using those little Shahed moped drones to go after transformers. They're dropping these big boys on power plants. And that's not something you repair in a few weeks. That's something that takes at least 18 months. And so the entirety of southern and eastern Ukraine, the lights have gone out, and they're having to bring in power from elsewhere. Different sort of war. Makes it very hard to defend, because the only way you can prevent this thing from hitting is to hit the plane that launched it before it drops it. And the planes, for the most part, never leave Russian airspace. Not that the Ukrainians aren't innovating. On the left, you've got a Ukrainian domestically built Beaver drone. The Ukrainians are many things. I would never put them in charge of PR. It's a horrible name. It's got a range of about 500 miles. It's got a payload of about 100 pounds. It doesn't fly by wire. It flies by GPS coordinates. So telemetry. The bottom left, that is an American-made Phoenix Ghost, and it has not been destroyed. It's in a state of assembly. It's modular, so you can take it apart. One dude can carry it in a backpack. The whole thing weighs about 50 pounds. Of that, about 10 to 15 pound warhead. It only has a range of maybe 20 to 30 miles and only a warhead of about 10 to 15 pounds, but it's site controlled. What they've been doing, the Ukrainians, is they've been using the Beavers launching from Ukrainian territory to go after the distillation towers and refineries across the Russian space. And then they've been sending special forces with the Phoenix Ghosts into Russia proper to launch them from really close in. And at this point, they've taken about 15% of Russian refining capacity offline. In their campaign so far, in the last 3 months, they have done more economic damage to the Russian system than 2.5 years of sanctions. It's a different sort of war. Both sides are going after the other's physical infrastructure at scale for the first time. And then there's us. On the left, you've got a population density map. Over here, you've got road and rail. Road in blue, rail in black. And you've got Ukraine here and here. What's happened in the last week is the Biden administration has given clearance, almost all of NATO has given clearance to the Ukrainians to use the weapon systems we have provided to go after places in Russia proper, on the other side of the border, that are launching attacks into Ukraine in real time. So for example, going after the bases that those fighters are dropping the glide bombs from. In that, two places matter more than the others. This is a city called Belgorod, and this is Rostov-on-Don. They are the two Russian population centers closest to the Ukrainian border, and they are the two logistical hubs that the Russians have been using for all of their military transit. If there is going to be an end to this war and Ukraine is going to continue to exist, those two centers need to be neutralized in some way. And for the first time in the war, the Ukrainians were able to take the war to Belgorod this last week. They've been going after air defense, rail depots, fuel depots, ammo dumps, and the Russians are starting to evacuate the city. Will it be enough? Way too soon to tell. We're in week 1. But this is the shape of the war. The rules are changing. The parameters are changing. I know that the front really hasn't moved much in the last year and a half, but this is actually one of the most dynamic wars I have ever studied, because every month there's a new weapon system, there's a new tactic. People are trying new things all the time. I don't know how this is going to go. I mean, I'm one of the few people who predicted that this war had to happen. And I was probably among the most optimistic about Ukraine's chances, and even I thought they were going to lose completely within a year. We were all wrong. And we all reassessed with new data, and we were all wrong again. I don't know how this is going to go. But I know who's going to be there at the end of it. Start with the Russians. Do I have a laser here? Okay. That cut at the top of the red, that's the post-Cold War collapse when the Russian death rate almost tripled and the birth rate dropped by 2/3 and held there for 15 years. Now, we know that that is accurate because in 2003, the Russians did their first post-Soviet census, their only post-Soviet census. And 5 years later, they stopped collecting census data altogether and just started making it up. So this bulge here among teenagers probably doesn't exist at all. That's why the Russians launched this war while they did. They don't have another generation to try. If they were going to use a mass military approach, it had to be about now. Ukrainian data is undoubtedly more accurate, and you can see how bad that is. This is Russia's last war. They've already, between defections, outmigration, deaths, and casualties, lost 1.5 million men. They can keep up the pace of what they're doing for another 6 to 8 years, but then they're done as a military power at all. And for Ukraine, 1/3 of the population are either displaced or refugees, especially among the younger folks, especially among women, especially among educated people. Which means win or lose, Ukraine ceases to function as a modern industrialized nation state within 30 years, even if they win. And within 60 years, the Ukrainian ethnicity will vanish from this earth. Everyone is fighting for time. If the Russians win, they have an external security cordon that's a little bit more sustainable, but eventually they die from lack of population. If the Ukrainians win, they still die out in a generation or two. And we're just trying to hold it open because we know the Russians are going down. And if they're fighting here, they're not flinging nukes at Atlanta. We're all fighting for time. And our alliance structure is also on borrowed time. Italy and Germany are the two most advanced demographies in the Western world. And within 15 years, we will have to decide whether we want to pay to continue for them to exist, because they won't be able to do it themselves. If there is a future to the Atlantic Alliance, it involves these 4 countries: Sweden, France, healthiest demographies in the rich world after the United States, and Poland. Now, Poland has a real problem, but it still has a bulge of people in their 30s and early 40s. So if they all have 4 kids, there will still be a Poland 40 years from now. But in the meantime, these are the 4 countries that will decide what Europe looks like. Thank God Sweden's in NATO now. In Asia, similar story. Our 3 closest allies, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan, are aging out. 20 years tops is what the big 2 have left. Taiwan might have 30. If there is a future, it's with these guys. Luckily, the Vietnamese do not have a grudge against us for the war. They just saw it as a little scuffle. There's this fun little monument garden in Hanoi, and there's a monument about that tall that's the monument to the American-Vietnamese conflict, because it lasted 20 years. And there's one about that tall to the Vietnamese-French conflict, which lasted about 2 decades. And then there's a 3-story one to the Vietnamese-Chinese War that they call the 2,000 Years War. These are good allies. Okay, let's just close up with the border because that's a simple problem. 3 things. Number 1, the US-Mexico border is 2,000 miles long. This is population density, by the way, and it's almost completely frontier. Most of it is completely unpopulated. It is the most difficult border in the world to secure. And I would argue that Donald Trump did it by the stupidest possible way by trying to build a wall. Think about what is required to build a wall. 2,000 miles long. You have a minimum of 50 supply roads that go from populated America across the greatest natural barrier on the continent, the Sonoran and the Chihuahuan deserts, to reach the construction sites. So half of the greatest buffer, the greatest block to human movement, you have now paved. And if you're south of the border and you can increase your income by a factor of 7 by using a ladder once, wouldn't you? History will record Donald Trump as the greatest friend to illegal migrants in American history. That's problem 1. Problem 2 is policy. By building the wall, but leaving trade with Mexico flowing, and incidentally, that is not something we want to break down, concentrated people without ladders into specific areas. And they started tapping asylum law. So instead of trying to cross unnoticed, they want to declare their presence and get in the queue. Now, if we were to process everyone who wants an asylum claim, we would need to expand the Department of Immigration and the related judicial branches by a factor of 20. And they know this. So they get in the queue, they get a court date, which doesn't have a firm day attached to it, and they're released. It's a really smart plan if you're a migrant. Now, what Donald Trump did is he broke and ended every inward migration program the United States has except for the H-1B visa. Everything else is down to 0. And before you think I'm anti-Trump, Biden went and codified all of that. Why? The unions are in the political wind, and the issue they care the most about is migration. So we won't get a meaningful immigration policy in this country until the unions finally pick a side. Nobody wants to piss them off. So that's where we are. Fortifying the border accelerates migration. Doing it through the asylum program accelerates migration. And so Joe Biden in the last week has done something what I find hilarious. You remember a few months ago when the hard-right Republicans insisted that certain really onerous restrictions get put into the new immigration law that Congress was negotiating? The restrictions that they put in made it into the would-be law. Trump then said, I don't want this law to be signed because it might be construed by some people as a win for Joe Biden. And so they turned on their own project. Joe Biden is now taking those most onerous constrictions and is trying to implement them as an executive order. It's hilarious from my point of view. Now, this is obviously unconstitutional because immigration is clearly a congressional prerogative. Whether or not it's going to be challenged in court, I don't know. But I can tell you it's not going to work. Because all it would do if you remove the asylum path is people go back to the illegal cross with a ladder path. Neither of these are good at regulating immigration at all. And as long as we're flipping back and forth between those two solutions, we're not going to make this any better. So let's move beyond the ideology and talk about the reality. Number 1, the United States has the greatest labor shortage in its modern history, and it's only going to get worse for the next 22 years. 2 million people came in illegally last year. If they hadn't, we would probably have 9 to 10% inflation already. So from an economic point of view, it's pretty clear where I stand. Second, most of the people coming in are no longer Mexican. Mexico, 35 years ago, started operationalizing NAFTA, and they started industrializing, and they started urbanizing, and the birth rate has dropped by 2/3. Inward migration from Mexico has been flat to negative for 15 years. Almost all of the migrants that have come in the last 5 years are Honduran, Nicaraguan, El Salvadorian, although there's a sprinkling and a diverse array of people who have come in the last 2 years. But still, mostly those three. They have a demographic structure that looks very similar to Mexico's, just about 5 years younger, because they got a free trade agreement with the United States in the year 2000. So that's also unlimited time. Third, that's AMLO. He's the Mexican president right now, and he just basically appointed his successor who won in a landslide. He's not a smart man. He basically combines the prickliness of Donald Trump with the ego of Hillary Clinton. And he's responsible for the cartels running rampant in the country. I mean, that's not fair. Half of it is our love of cocaine, so don't do cocaine. The other half is him insisting that there's not a problem. Anywho, he doesn't want to cooperate with the United States on anything. But migration provides an in, because Mexico is no longer a source of migrants to the United States. In fact, Mexico is now a destination country for the first time. And that has changed the conversation. So I would argue we have a choice between one of two ways forward. Number one, we try to go with the wall strategy, but instead of building a wall, we do it with AMLO, because he hates the migrants more than we do. And while a single wall won't work, if you think of Mexico as a 2,000-mile long wall, that's a very different proposition. That's solution number one. Solution number two is something we've already done. Back in the 70s, a series of hurricanes devastated Central America, wiped out the fields, destroyed the homes, and 500,000 people just started walking north, because if they had stayed, they would have died. The Carter administration, of all people, sent INS down and just started handing out 3-year worker permits to anyone who wanted one. You come to the United States, you register, you pay your taxes, you keep your nose clean. At the end of 3 years, you have a choice. Option one, get a flight home. Option two, pay for a 1-year renewal. Option three, start the path to citizenship. It worked. Hard to imagine that working in today's political climate. But in an environment of labor shortages, we do have a resource that is knocking at the door. The alternative, turn Mexico into a wall. Both of these are viable options. Okay. If you're looking for more, the video log is at the top left. If you're looking to give money, the video log is free and I won't share your data with anyone. But if you like it and you want to pay for it anyway, give it to this QR code. This is MedShare. They're a medical charity that provides medical assistance to communities who cannot look after themselves because of something that's not their fault. So for example, if the Russians start dropping 2-ton bombs on your power grid, they step in and help with surgical kits, fuel, and generators. For the month of June, I am matching donations that go to this link. So please help out.